Haidete o Philoi. I'm Fletcher from amindforlanguage.com, and you're listening to Greeking Out, a podcast for ancient and Koine Greek learners full of tools, tips, and possibly tirades on learning Greek using comprehension-based methods. If that isn't familiar to you, check out episode 0, the Manifesto, for more info. In this episode, I'm talking with Michael Kopf, who along with his wife Katie form Agros Education. They offer classes in Latin and, for us, Ancient Greek. And you can study with him with a full immersion approach or via English or German. But today we're talking about comprehensible input and things like that, and really all things related to Greek. But there's a couple of themes in this episode that I thought were really cool and takeaways for me too. And one of those is thinking Greek. And he tells a cool story about where that came from. But really the idea of how do we develop the mind of an ancient Greek speaker? How do we train our mind to think in Greek instead of our first languages? Another emphasis you'll see in here is focusing on particular texts, particular narratives and things, rather than trying to focus on the grammar or the overarching theory. Get down into the weeds and in the roots. That's helpful. Another theme is the value of memorization and internalizing snippets of text or poems, or snippets could be narrative sections or prose or whatever, and just getting those in and again digging down into these particular texts and internalizing things that way. And I thought this was really neat because this is how a lot of these texts would have been originally experienced. They would have been read aloud or chanted or sung or something like that. So anyway, those are a few takeaways. Get your earbuds and join us for a really interesting and a little bit longer and wide-ranging conversation about Greek and linguistics and how we can improve as speakers and enjoyers, if that's the right word, of this great ancient language. Hi, Michael. Thanks for agreeing to be on the podcast. It's always great to have more stories and other people on here from all over the world. And I guess honestly, now that I think about it, the number of I'm in the United States, and the number of quote Americans from the U.S. that I've had on here is actually probably pretty small compared to other places. And so you're in Austria, you said? Is that right?
That's right. Yes. Thank you for having me, Fletcher. It's good to be here. Yes, I was born and raised in Austria, as one might hear. And since a couple years, we've been back now. So I'm now settled in Austria. And working from here online most of the time. Yes.
Okay. Well, kind of like we always do. What's your story? First of all, how did you get interested in learning ancient or Koine or whichever period of Greek you got started with? What got you into it?
Well, I always say that after high school, I knew that I was not good at maths and not good with numbers. And so I wanted to study humanities, whatever. And so in school, I had only Latin. And I didn't want to, because in Europe you have to choose your subjects when you go to university or to college, you would say. We don't have anything like college in this exact way. And so you have to choose your subjects. And because I didn't want to decide for or against certain disciplines, I knew that Latin was going to give me a very broad a variety of materials and subjects. And then as a teenager, then I looked at what else might be there, and I just basically calculated that ancient Greek should be similar, if not deeper, because it's, so to say, underneath. It's even the classical Greek culture is older than the classical Roman culture. That's as I knew that much after high school, and so I decided to study Latin and ancient Greek at university, and I have to say that that is one of the decisions in my life that really really worked out way better than I could have ever imagined, because it gave me exactly what I was looking for. Now I can basically view the world or see the world through this lens of looking at the human history, or this sort of at history of at human nature, with a very broad outlook, starting with the classical world, and then through reception basically up to today's times. So it's and then of course if you're linguistically minded, then it's basically the same thing, or that's mostly what I mean with this actually, is that when I see a new word in English or in French or also in German for that matter, when I encounter a new word, my mind immediately goes to the etymology mode of what that might literally mean, and this is then how I mostly appreciate this word for the yeah, especially in the beginning. Yeah.
So, do you remember your first ancient Greek class? Do you have any like what was any stories from that you can recall of like walking into class, and what was it like? How were you taught initially?
Initially, yes, I had just enrolled in the classics program at the university in Germany, and it was a very conventional introduction to Greek language and culture, as they called it. And we were basically, it was a class for people who already knew Latin, but you had to take a little Greek exam to fulfill certain requirements for their Latin curriculum. And so that's how we were taught. It was all yeah, very translationese sort of thing. You already know your Latin translationese, and then the presumption or the general assumption was that you can do the same thing with ancient Greek. You just have to learn new forms for the accusative case, and then you translate it just like you would translate a Latin accusative case. And so that I really admired my instructor, and I still have very fond memories of him as a person, and of some things that were said in that class. But in the end, I fear that I have to say that it wasn't the greatest success pedagogically. So after 2 years of this sort of Greek classes, I don't know how much or how little that I would say I knew after that. It was, yeah. Then things changed, right? Then I was lucky enough to get on a spoken Greek track uh, after 3 years actually at university. Then I heard about an institution that taught Greek in a spoken way, and from then things took a serious turn. Although I'm never sure how much cushion I had prepared in this time that I spent, basically translating and memorizing vocabulary and grammar and so on. But then, as when I got into spoken Greek, it went very fast, and I have in the meantime I have also seen that with some students and clients, that those with serious passive knowledge can really, as it were, skyrocket and go through the roof within weeks.
Hmm.
They can activate lots and lots and lots of language, I would say.
Yeah, that's. I think it's interesting. I've picked up a couple of different books, recently, or read some different things about, or listened to podcasts about, active comprehensible input based stuff, and a lot of it seems to say that still flashcards and your basic memorization techniques for vocabulary is still one of the most effective ways of learning and acquiring new vocab. I mean, I think it's a piece of it, right? Like you may memorize them, sort of like load them in, but then hopefully you're working with material that's going to have a lot of occurrences. So then it goes from a memorized piece of, a memorized fact into active language or into language through repeated exposure, and you can start building that wider grasp. But so I mean that makes a lot of sense to me that even if they have a, like you said, a passive knowledge or a memorized knowledge from a grammar translation course, that can convert into something else fairly quickly.
Yes, yes, indeed. That's as I said. I think I observed this a couple times quite clearly that that happened with with this whole, as it were, second language acquisition science numerical stuff. Um, I for myself at least I have to say I don't know what I should say to it, or I don't feel like I'm an expert in that. For example, when you say that vocabulary memorization and so on is effective, I start wondering how that is measured.
Yeah.
Because because then if you measure it exactly in the way that the vocabulary list memorization would presuppose in the first place, the whole thing is a bit circular. And
Hmm.
then in my human mind, or as a I try in my teaching and also in my own personal study and how I take in things from from texts, but also from grammar, I would say. As such, I try to have a holistic view of the language, but also of human nature as such. And there, I think it's very clear to me, and we that not all words are the same. For
Hmm.
example, and so when people say, "Yeah, learn vocabulary or broaden your vocabulary," then my first thought is, well, you can do this with mostly nouns with nice photos next to them. And it's
Yeah.
not very difficult to teach people the words for dog and tree and fire and water and maybe even island and river and stuff like that. But then as long as things are nice objects that one can, as it were, grasp, even if only mentally, then that's all good. But as soon as words become more not even just abstract, but also functional and grammatical, as it were,
Yeah.
then one has to, it's crystal clear that one has to see them in context, right?
Hmm.
I'm thinking one might think of prepositions and conjunctions, and so those parts of speech that are those little functional words, but also, for example, certain verbs that, as they say, would function mostly as support verbs.
Yeah.
So something like conducting is what can one conduct in English? But having a party, but conducting a
Yeah. I mean, like you
funeral, are
conducted.
those conducted? I don't know,
Yeah. I mean,
but
like a symphony or a musical performance is conducted,
of course,
or
yes, but
like a.
surgery is conducted, isn't it?
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah. So this sort of very abstract phrasal thing that
Yeah.
it's easy also to find in English. That's this stuff where context, at least the context of one sentence, I'm not even talking yet about full on context with an intention a proper situation between speaker and the intended addressee and so on, but yeah, just the context of a phrase, maybe that already is a step into territory where it's difficult to do flashcards with nice photos, or to
Yeah.
measure how many words on a list was this person able to recall from memory, as it were. It's like language is a bit more complex and a bit more interwoven than that appreciation that point of view would suggest. I fear.
Yeah,
Uh,
I agree. That's a really good point, actually.
mm,
That again probably should inform how we think about vocabulary growth is, certain words, like you said, like conduct in English, and perhaps, I think of, you were talking, I was thinking of echo and how it's used quite differently, and it can be mean to have or possess something, but it's also used to note like qualities and adjectives and descriptors and things, and at least in Koine. which I wouldn't expect coming from English. I mean, we don't use have like that. I mean, you don't have green or have,
Yes,
something like that. I mean, the
quite
closest
famously, yeah.
and we might say have blue eyes, but even that's like that's a little bit different. Way it's
Yes, it's I mean it's a very simple truths that have very, very large consequences. Like I say to especially beginners, but also intermediate learners, that ancient Greek does not depend on English. So
yes.
just if you're able or to say something in English in a simple way, that doesn't mean that you have to suppose that it has the same feel to it, or it's just as accessible maybe, or as common simply in Greek, because and it's comical when one makes it explicit, because everybody says, yeah, of course. But still, we find ourselves, I think, again and again implying that ancient Greek is codified English, or that English is normal human thought, and
Yes.
everything that is not English has to be deciphered or decoded, and then finally we arrive at some, as I said, some normal human thought, which is then English. And this of course, I'm saying this not as an English native speaker. So for me, when I look at certain materials and also auxiliaries like dictionaries and grammar books uh, in English, then I think that is an advantage that I sometimes have, that I see two languages which are not my first language.
Mm.
And I think the first language is a sort of gilded cage that and I might have the same with German, of course. I'm not saying that there's any difference in this sense, but the gilded cage is kind of, or the first language, as soon as you have a couple syllables in your first language, you think, finally we're back, and you can just think unencumbered or disencumbered. And that's I think a simple idea that has huge consequences for how we see foreign or other languages. Yeah.
And that is a really good point. And I don't know if we've made it yet in any of the episodes on this podcast, is that English is not, or people's native language is not like, it's not the base of human language. It may be where what we as individuals are comparing everything to, because that's sort of our first, the first language that got bootstrapped in our brains, perhaps. And I think, again, as an American, I grew up in a largely monolingual environment. I mean, I only grew up speaking English until I got interested in languages in high school. But even really, I was an adult before I got into any significant fluency in a second or third language. Whereas I imagine for you growing up in Europe, that's probably a different story. I mean, you're certainly more, you know, uh, probably certainly more aware of those things. But I mean, Austria and Germany are big places, so maybe that's not a valid assumption to make. But
No, no, I think by the very nature of our schools and of our school curricula, that is already true.
hmm,
I might also mention that we have two little kids at home. They grow up. My wife is U.S. American, and so our two daughters are growing up bilingually, or with two languages, two first languages. And yeah, it's almost daily business for me to wonder what that means to have two first languages. I mean, that's by itself already paradoxical, because I also had what you said. We always compare everything, or we try to bring everything back to our first language, because that's just how we've always thought. And for my own biography, I always so in Austria or in Europe, in non-English speaking Europe, maybe one should say that I think practically in every country it's mandatory to learn English
hmm.
as the mostly as the first, by far mostly as the first foreign language. And so that's already something, that if English is your first language, you don't have that, right? And then we have very commonly Latin and French and Italian and Spanish. And then some people are even lucky enough to have ancient Greek in middle school or high school, which as I said, I did not. I started it at college level or at university level, as we say. But I always have one episode that I recall when thinking about this, like what you said about language learning and growing up. And I had mandatory English classes starting at age 10 or 11, 11, I think. And then, you are, of course, you're a child, but it's still pre-puberty, but at the same time, you're not learning your first language is totally established, of course, at age 10 or 11, but still it's a totally different language learning, of course. And I do remember that my English teacher, when I was 11 or 12 years old, she just made a remark under one of my homework assignments that I had submitted. She just wrote in that red pen that the teachers still have, I guess, think English, exclamation point. And and of course, I was a bit, surprised by this statement, but at the same time, it made perfect sense. I mean, for example, you learn things like negations in English. Instead of saying I go to school, you have to say I do not go to school. Whereas from a German mind, you would always say I go not to school, right? And so
Right. Yeah.
they spend months, if not years, drilling this, that you have to say, I do not, he does not, he did not, and so on, because that is foreign to us as German native speakers. And to me, as an 11-year-old, this think English just made total sense because we were also back then in the early 2000s, we were already taught in immersion. So
Mm.
our English speaker, while being an Austrian just like us, but she spoke only English to us, except for some grammar explanations. So it was astoundingly similar to what people suggest now be done in English and in Latin and in Greek and in other languages. So
Right.
she was just speaking English, was just immersion, and then she would explain some grammar points in German, and that was it. But this think English, I mean, it's outrageously simple-minded, you could say, and what an affront that is to a rationally thinking person. But the tricky thing is that it's also true. You just have to do the switch and try to think. I don't know if code switch is the right word, but you just have to go to this other language, and you have to leave your own gilded cage, as it were, your first language. Try to exclude that as much as you can, and try to work with what you have in your target language, in the language that you want to study. So this think English, that is really kind of something that I often think about. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thought. I think if you say like think Greek, that's
Mhm.
helpful after someone has enough exposure, right? So like if they're learning in an immersion style or, with a lot of comprehensible input, then that's a helpful thing to say because you're saying, remember what you've seen or what feels right for this, not how would I say this if I was just translating. Um,
But at the same time, it's also wisdom in the sense that I sometimes find that English does a lot of things with its vocabulary or with its lexicon.
mm,
And I keep finding things that are distinctions that are made in English purely by lexicon, which
yeah,
our Latin and Greek do, or other languages might not do with different words, but with maybe grammatical structures
yeah, that's true.
and patterns and forms, maybe, or it's syntax, or it's a phrase, or whatever.
Well,
To the point where when you say think, if you were to say think Greek, that could mean try working with what you
mm,
have. Don't fall into the trap of, but in English I would not say it like this, I would say it like that. So how? Because then you try to kind of engineer your Greek with an English idea in the sense that you might have a sentence that is English at the core, and then of course you can clothe it, as it were, with Greek words and syllables, and but you create the zombie, right? That is
Yeah.
English in the core, but it's mummified with Greek or Latin or whatever letters and syllables. That's not how it works. So, and it's especially important, I think, when you come to ancient languages with an English mindset, because
Hmm.
English has sometimes such a distinct and differentiated, again, lexicon where you, and also good English style, some people say, is really needs a lot of lexical distinctions and synonyms and fancier words and not so fancy words, and then the smartest of the smart people start quarreling about overdoing it and not overdoing it, whether you should say humongous or you should just say very big, and so on. So, but in Greek especially, I feel like it's really important that you use basic vocabulary, and you can use basic lexical stems uh, to a much greater extent, or they carry you much further than
Hmm.
they might in English. Because a verb like boieo, or even a word like anthropos covers a totally different kind
Yes.
of map. It's a totally different beast than an English word which you might have. And so yeah, I think that's why I think there is wisdom in saying no, 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 try to think Greek. So try working with what you have and try making with your, especially when I think of Greek basic verbs and with prepositional prefixes, it should be amazing what you can do with very little material, so to say, but combining it in different ways and in this way. And I think, especially again coming from an English mindset, one might feel the need of greater lexicon and of more vocabulary, but that is actually not necessarily as necessary in Greek, especially when I think of some textbooks and so on, and they introduce adjectives, especially adjectives. And then I look up where those adjectives are actually attested, and you see, it's really rather poetic or late adjectives, whereas nice classical Greek makes do with a basic, modest number of adjectives, I would say. So this is how I
Huh.
view it at the moment. But you ask me again in 10 years, and maybe I hope that I will know more.
Well, but I mean that is a really good point. I mean, if you think about, languages for communication, and so English, for example, has a relatively poor grammatical system. So we can't put as much weight on the grammar to communicate, whereas Greek has, you have how many hundreds of, forms of the participle. So there's a lot of communication that can happen just on the by changing the grammar. So like I was reading, I think it was Third John in the New Testament recently, and there's this thing talking about like teachers going out having, it says they went out, which is an aorist verb. So, at least I read that as a single action at a point in time, and generally in the past, at least in the, Koine. And then there's a active participle, lambanontes, and it's present active. It's a present active participle, which to my mind means ongoing. Um, it's an ongoing state of affairs for these people. They haven't. It's like me lambanontes, so not receiving anything. So it's saying these teachers went out and they're not receiving anything from the people they're teaching, right? And so in the context of the letter, the writer is urging his friend to help support these people, give them food, place to stay, whatever. But I was looking at how someone had translated that, and they said in their journeys they receive nothing. And I'm like, that's not actually in the Greek at all. There's nothing about journeys, but it makes total sense in English because we can't, even if I said they went out not receiving, that could just mean at the moment they left, they didn't get anything. Or prior to leaving, no one gave them any food to take with them or something. But I feel like in Greek that actually does carry that idea of like they left and now they are currently still not getting anything. Like at any point in this process, like this is an ongoing state of affairs for them. But to get that in English, like you have to add a bunch of stuff into the sentence. So
Yeah, I think that that is an excellent observation. It's also it depends on where you come from for the Greek, what the important lesson to learn
yes,
is. If you are coming from so there's a real divide, I feel, among Greek learners. Some think that the present tense is the default form. Maybe that's more for those who've been practicing with or studying with conventional textbooks and so on. They are presented with the dictionary form of a verb and think lambano simply means I take or I receive.
right.
But in the example that you gave with me lambanon, the first thing is that of course it's negated, and that's always funny business. If it's negated and then you try to do the aspect, while they weren't receiving or while they didn't receive, it's kind of the same thing. But that's just a side remark. What I wanted to say is that others then correctly, I think, take the aorist, or what you should do, I think, is take the aorist as the simplest, uh, most default, unmarked sort of form, especially for participles.
Mm.
It depends always if you're in a narrative or not. But let's say this lambanon, this arguably, just as the form of the word would suggest, by having more letters, it has more markers and it has a lot more information than a labontes.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
what I simply was trying to say is that even if your textbook taught you the form labontes after the form lambanontes, that's actually growing a wrong intuition. That's communicating a wrong intuition. Labontes should be arguably more less marked than lambanontes. And from an English mind, you can understand this very, very well, because in your progressive or in your continuous tenses, you're always adding auxiliary verbs.
Yeah.
So instead of saying he slept, you say he was sleeping. There is more material there, and this material reality already suggests that there is more marking going on. It's more complicated than simply he slept. And the same is true for what is dear to my heart is telling people that the imperfect tense in Greek is this sort of loaded, marked form
Hmm.
that you have to recognize and see that it means more than a simple aorist. Right? Just like when you say he was sleeping, there is more. It's more complicated than simply saying he slept. So to draw this or to tease stuff out of this and say in their journeys, I like that. I liked it quite well. I mean, judging from what you just said, because on the other hand, a prepositional phrase with such an abstract noun, I wouldn't see as elegant in Greek. I
Yeah.
spent some time looking into ways of saying ways of referring to places, as in situations, like in the common room or in the hallway and stuff like that. It's astonishingly difficult to find to find places where they talk about especially rooms and places in the house or around the house in the way that we do. That might have everything to do with culture and what houses look like and so on, of course. But then also I found that really very often they, and that's why I like this example that you gave, because there seems to be it seems to confirm once more my suggestion that they do this with what we see as subtle. So you just had this lambanontes, a present participle or progressive participle, and then I would also add prepositional prefixes to verbs, especially verbs of motion. So
Hmm.
instead of saying he went into the house, you simply have eiselte, and that's it. and there is no there is no he doesn't mention the house, right? Or
Yeah.
this famous Endonestin, he is inside, he is home or something. And yeah, I think there is a lot there, but it's definitely more elusive or harder to pin down this way of talking. Yeah. But I think that might be a nice way of demonstrating what one could mean by saying that there's fewer words or lexemes, as it were, and more patterns and structure and stuff like that. I like that. Yes.
Yeah. So I guess this seems, we've sort of moved a little bit away from your story, but we're taking that think Greek idea and sort of exploring, well, what does that mean, right? Like part of learning to think Greek actually doesn't necessarily always mean having to learn more Greek, but just getting a sense of, how did Greeks construe reality? How did they, how does the system work? And again, I remember listening to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast that Ollie Richards does. And one of the things that he recommends is like go get a grammar and just read the thing. Don't try to memorize it. Like this is one of his early language learning tips. Like when you're beginning a new language, just read the grammar. Don't memorize it. Don't try to learn, don't try to learn stuff. Just build some familiarity with how the system as a whole works. Which I think makes a lot of sense because um, I was reading a post by I think Scott Young, and he said, one of the greatest predictors, and I think there's some research to back this up, of children's academic success is actually not any inherent intelligence. It's how much background information they come into a class having. So if you can somehow, again, not memorizing because that's a waste of time, but like if you could just get a sense of this is how Greek as a system works, you've now got a lot more pegs. So when you encounter something new, you have something to connect it to, and your brain can absorb that faster. So, even if we're not learning to think Greek in Greek, learning how Greek works in broad strokes is, I think, could make that then learning the actual Greek um, more efficient.
I'm not sure that I would want to keep it at that, because it sounds a lot like what the conventional method I feel wants to do from the start. The For example, in many institutional introductions to Greek, there's almost no time set aside for vocabulary study or vocabulary repetition, for
Mm,
example. So that only works if you have an at least implicitly a view of things that vocabulary is random or particular, and we don't need to
mm.
study the particular, but the particular, no? We can just go right to the rule without having to waste time, as it were, with examples and specific cases. And I think that's really not very human. That's you're trying
That's a good point.
to program a computer who needs the input simply once. But I think if you look at human beings, the most natural thing to do should be, as you well know, frequency and repetition and what
Yeah.
what is that called, with intervals. Kind of, you
Oh,
have to look at the
space
same thing.
repetition.
Yeah, paste, that's the word. Again and again and again. While when you read, but I just don't think that that's the message people need. I see,
Yeah.
again, because there is something to be said for theory, definitely. As an adult learner, it's very gratifying and motivating to look at, sometimes at least, to look at charts and at the grand scheme of things and the rhyme and reason why things are what they are and so on. And that's very, I think that's very natural, and that's nothing bad with that. But then we cannot be carried off to the clouds and try staying up there. We have to come down back to ground ourselves back to earth and see what things actually look like in the texts that interest us. So I do, in fact, with my clients, I try to move out of textbooks as fast as possible, and I try to read original extant texts with them as soon as I can, with that very much in mind. That especially if you look at most textbooks in their second half, or especially in their last third, they will do the texts in the textbooks are more often than not much more difficult and complex than what you typically find even in classical authors, which is absurd. So I think what I much rather like to do is I introduce depending on the individual interests of the client, but we could read the narrative passages from the gospel, parables, miracle stories, or other Koine texts. There's, for example, the Philogelos, this joke book that I find still needs I'm still planning on doing an excerpting that text, because there are some really pedagogically valuable like there are lots of let's say not kid friendly jokes in there, but there are really some jokes where you can show some grammar points or some tense usage or some particle usage really phenomenally well, and that's always a pleasure to show this. Then there's Diogenes Laertius, the lives of famous philosophers. There is just so much more also narrative, simple narrative, Aesop's fables, but also the life of Aesop. There is also stuff again on the Christian side with patristics and church fathers that one can, after one excerpts some meaningful passages, especially narrative passages. The ancients really had a way of marking their narratives with a clear beginning, middle, and outcome sort of thing. So that should really be, and it has been done, of course. If you look at old textbooks from the 19th century, they had lots of anthologies, and then sometimes they would just shorten it, abbreviate it. Sometimes they would make some changes in order to simplify matters. But that seems to me more so. In short, reading Koine texts that might be considered uh, lesser on a literary scale is, in my view, a much better idea than spending yet another year or two with some fancy textbook that was written by, somebody who maybe it's all very written very well, but it's all just a brainchild, as it were. It has no. I'd much rather read earthy Koine, as it were, or Epictetus and stuff like this, if people can stomach it. Stoic texts. I much rather read that, even though I know that it's not, some things might be said differently in Attic and so on. But I just think this delivers also the exposure and the frequency, spend time with that, and free up some capacity by getting more familiar with the basics. And then it's easier really to go from there to some older Greek or some poetic poetry, or some more elaborate classic prose. Most of the time, in my view and experience, it's not the theoretical horizon. It's really just a lack of familiarity with the basics. And I mean, it goes all the way, like way down to accent rules, syllable length, stuff like that, but also basic sentence structure. How do I write a simple definition? Right? Where does the accent go on the Estin, for example? One can, and as I said, in my experience, I have already sometimes guided back some clients who were already in despair trying to read some nicer Greek, but they were just unhappy with how they were faring. So I pulled them back, and we read either the New Testament or Epictetus or the Aesop stuff that I mentioned. and we just really put the finger on certain painful things that have everything to do with the first 10 pages of your textbook. So that's no fancy stuff. It's really only how does the esteem work? How does the subject and the object stuff work? Where do the exits go and stuff like that? And then once you have greater familiarity with these basics, or I mean, now I'm already assuming that we're talking about active Greek, immersive Greek, and so on. So for a person that only reads passively and translates and so on, like for them, it's even clearer when I say, how do you form an accusative from this word? How do you form the aorist from this word? Right? How do we do? How do we? What does the? You have to actively form an infinitive and so on. The more familiar, and that's a key advantage of actively practicing,
Yeah.
again, Latin or Greek, that you are so familiar with these basics that you have more capacity uh, opened up for your interpretation of what the text wants to say, or for when you go from a lesser, as it were, koine to some nice piece of classical prose. If you're totally familiar with what the koine does, then you really have the capacity to concentrate on what's different in the classical Attic or in the poetry that you read and so on. Also, for example, for fans of the New Testament and so on, and church fathers and so on, you if you're totally familiar and if you have an idea with the basics, and if you have an idea of what normal, if you have your own normal, right? If you have your this, I'm so familiar with this simple style, for example, then only then can you immediately recognize an odd word,
Yes.
right? That you can read two paragraphs and then a word strikes you and you're like, and of course you have the humility to think, well, maybe it is a normal word. It's just me as a learner who is here to learn more. So what's this word? But then when you hit a certain level of familiarity, suddenly you realize, wait a minute, this word really doesn't appear anywhere else in Paul, or this word really is a direct quote from some classical author or something.
Yeah.
So then you can separate the really fancy stuff from the run-of-the-mill normal, modest prose, right? That's also something that I remember very clearly coming from a conventional grammar translation background, that for me, everything was equally difficult. And then after some years of speaking and reading Koine Greek mostly, and suddenly I had this bump where I realized, yeah, I can see now also as I started reading Plato and Ethic stuff, that I realized there was this inner dialogue almost going on with, I would say it like this. And so learning Attic or really any other kind of style is much easier because you learn it by contrast. Whereas otherwise I definitely was in a program that tried to teach you Homeric Greek, and so we were reading Homer and Plato in the same term as the second term or something, and then you have no chance of ever growing roots anywhere because you're trying to stuff both of them through a door where one barely fits through, and in the end nobody gets through. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
The shoulders hit and you can't get through the door frame anymore.
That's right. And if you just make one guy go through, and then when this guy is inside, then the other guy can come afterward. So, and this is what I still, of course, this is now where I feel now I feel at home in Greek. That is, if I look at something, I have a first idea of what that sounds like, or what this is a really strange word. I'm not too familiar with this word. I know I can tell you for sure that it's not a common word in this author and in that author and this and that. And now I feel like now I'm navigating this, with a scholarly dictionary and so on that tells you for example, that a rare word is used only in these authors and this and that, right? But that's of course not what is too relevant for the beginner, what we're mostly talking about, right?
Yeah, but yeah, I'm listening to you, what you've said there, and it reminds me of Paul Nation's idea of like four strands of language learning, which, that book, I think his book, like, what do you need to learn to or know to know a language? It's a PDF. It's on the website of his university. But, he says, you need, basically input, output, um, fluency practice, and I forget the fourth right now, but one of those points is that you go back to what, like, that fluency development. Oh, explicit language study. That's right. Input, output, explicit language study, and fluency development. And that fluency development is just sticking with stuff you're already relatively comfortable with, but pushing to get better at it, to get faster at it, to stick with, like you said, stick with lower level text that you're quite comfortable in, but just get more familiar and keep working with those until they're that second nature and you have that, I would say it this way, kind of feeling because you've read them enough to internalize it and you can read them comfortably and quickly. Perhaps even to the same, level of like first language kind of, comfort. And then, like you said, that gives you that foundation to then move on and be able to recognize the contrast of, oh, this word is rare or this is whatever. Um, and it seems like, one of the major errors, like you mentioned too, with the university style or conventional style is they put everything on explicit language instruction, neglecting the other three stands of development, input, and output. And then maybe for some of us, like I think for myself, I'm not doing much output, in my day-to-day use of the language or practice of it. So that's another piece that I'm probably missing because I'm mostly in the input side of things, mostly reading and maybe memorizing vocabulary. As a way to help get to more difficult texts. But actually, that's a question I have for you. I'm curious. One of my usual questions is how do you help people, or how did you get over like that hump from like intermediate to advanced? And specifically, the thing I'm always most curious about is like my grammar's pretty with Koine especially. I'm pretty comfortable with Greek grammar. Like I can usually look at a thing and figure out get a close enough parsing that I can make sense out of it and move on. But then when I go from New Testament to say Homer, the vocabulary is just so different. It's not necessarily that I can't parse out what's going on in the grammar or the sentence structure. It's just there's so many new words. Um, so how do you recommend like that? That seems to be the hardest thing in Greek is when you jump from one Greek to another style. It's just they just use a completely different set of vocab, and so it ceases to be comprehensible because there's just so many new words. So how, and maybe you already answered that with the idea of reading excerpts, but how would you recommend, or how did you accomplish that, and how do you recommend people handle that vocabulary gap?
It's interesting that your two questions that I can link your two questions with Homer, who you mentioned, because number one, you mentioned that you yourself or many autodidacts might be in this situation that they have little to no output or production that and they feel like at least they have to take it all in passively through reading and listening. One thing that I definitely recommend, and I say this to all of my students and clients, is that they can, even if it's tedious, I really recommend forcing yourself to read aloud.
Hmm.
This is something that makes sense on many, many levels. People also keep telling us that in antiquity itself, people were reading out loud, and that ancient texts are meant to be read out loud and all that. But it's also, I think, again, on a human, in the framework of human nature. If you think about what's the normal thing as a human to do when you learn a language, which is a natural human language, and you're a natural human being. So how do those typically go together? And it should be clear that speaking
Yeah.
is part and parcel of that of what the language is, how the language is meant to get together with you as a person, or your mind, or your brain, or however you want to you want to phrase that. And if you have nobody to speak to, as I said, this reading aloud thing, or merely the pronunciation of the words and syllables and sentences, I think this is powerful, and this is what I did myself also. Reading aloud, and especially when you do Greek, try to hit every accent. Try to stress every word on the right syllable. And for most learners, most beginners, this is hard enough. And so as you read aloud and try to pronounce well, if you are more aiming for the classical period, I would also include syllable length, so that to keep your long syllables long and your short syllables short. Maybe even keep your long vowels long and your short vowels short, while maybe the syllable might be long and all that. There's a whole system to
Yes.
discover there. Read aloud, and even if it's not communication, even if you say, I have no partner for doing conversational exercises and so on, you are a human being. You have a mind that processes language, which you engage all the time when you do language learning. But also think about the fact that you have a body and you have muscles. And so when you pronounce, when you read aloud, it's more tedious, but you are also just doing more and you're engaging more in what you do. Simply because your lips and your the air doesn't move itself. You have to push it places. You have to use your vocal cords. You have to coordinate so many muscles in your mouth and your tongue and whatnot. And all that is done. Some people would say by your brain. Other people would say by you. It's you. You are a person, and you are engaging with this language. And so there, then think also about memory. That if your speech apparatus, let's call it that, your tongue and your chin and your lips and your vocal cords, all of that together, and your mind, you can train yourself really to say anthropos, right? And you become familiar with it, not just mentally, not just with maybe even the visual value, the image of the spelling, which is something very real, something that I also have, that I look at something and say, this is how it's what it always looks like, right? The word in its spelling. But then also I'm really, and I think every athlete and every sports expert and so on will probably agree that your muscles have memory. And so it rolls off the tongue, and you just know what to do. And when you say anthropos, the third syllable already, there is no explicit thought that is behind every syllable. Whereas in the beginning it might. So we also have speech therapy. We have, actors are trained and practice themselves pronunciation and so on. So there is, nowadays, we have all of that knowledge and all of that awareness of these things. But then for language learning, you can totally, and you should, I think, it's a human normal thing to activate also your physical you. And maybe I also, with my clients, I also try to motivate them and get them to memorize poetry. The nice thing, poetry is easier to memorize than prose, especially if you have a model recording that you can simply imitate. It's not fancy like singing Homer or to tragedies, reciting tragedies or anything like that. You don't have to look at it like that. You can also look at it as nursery rhymes. So you take, and we have simple poetry that amounts to not much more than nursery rhymes or simple ideas, but then you memorize a line or two, and of the obvious advantage is that you can go for a walk, take a stroll through nature or in the park or wherever, and you can pronounce it, recite it, sing it, and play with it. And this is the most normal thing for a human being to do. And then the snowball effect is that the more familiar you are with, and this familiarity It's another thing. Knowledge in English sounds very cerebral, sounds very brainy. But then there is also an intimate knowledge and a familiarity with with the language or with individual words, syllables, and even sounds. So that's where the snowball comes in. The more familiar you are with pronouncing anthropos, the more familiar you are with the individual sounds, which are there in so many other words. You know, you can think of the
Hmm.
alphabet simply
Yeah.
like that, or you can think of it as a stress pattern that it's ba ba ba, and then you do a genitive, and suddenly it's anthropu. So, and the same pattern is found not only in this word, but in hundreds, if not thousands, of other words.
Hmm.
And so this is where studying again studying a specific case helps you with understanding, and maybe not understanding, but becoming more familiar, more intimately familiar with general rules.
Right.
So I'm saying specific case, general rules. So, and this is how do you become familiar with something? You have to spend time with it. You have to be exposed to it with frequency and all that. So I think things that don't necessarily sound very attractive nowadays, like memorization and recital, but you can also think of language games and nursery rhymes and so on, and that has much more potential than I think we might think. So that was your first thing with not having anybody to converse with. Engage your body, engage your speech apparatus. That does a lot. That's probably much more than you would think. And the second thing is, because you said Homer,
Well, vocabulary
uh,
really in those gaps.
memorize. If you want to do homework, many out there want to, then I really recommend, instead of trying to read it by the page,
Yeah.
really read the proem. The proem of the Iliad has in poetry 7 lines. Memorize those and try to find a nice old school commentary that explains the forms to you, then that explains why it is what it is. Because when you study Homer, there is no or there's very little of a self-sustained language to speak of. It
Mm.
really it it firmly rests on the meter. The rhythm of the poem is the air that it breathes. There is, if you rip those words and those forms and also the vocabulary, of course, the words, if you rip them out of this poem and you try to speak in it in prose, that's a very problematic, very questionable enterprise, I think.
Mm.
But if you want to study Homer, you have it's a beautiful thing to do, but it's chiseled in stone, and you kind of have to rub that stone to get some warmth out of it, I fear. The
And
other thing, because you said from Homer, from the New Testament to Homer, it's probably an extreme case. But other than that, if you said you wanted to go from the New Testament to Attic, I believe that it's what I already said, that if you're really good at Koine and also at New Testament Greek as a, more a narrower term, because when I say Koine, I also include Hellenistic Greek at
yeah.
large. If you're really good at this sort of Greek, then maybe there are some intermediate, some texts in between. There's certainly texts in between the Gospels and Plato, but it is all in all a doable route with a couple stations maybe in between. But the thing is, um, you have to find firm ground to tread on. So and if you that's key. It's key that you don't try to, if you're not yet sure or certain about one dialect and you try to cram in another one or two, that's probably not gonna work. But
Mm.
if you're really certain and have a firm grasp of one dialect, if it's really workable, let's say you know how to form the basic paradigms, you know what what case morphology looks like and what the present tense and the aorist looks like. That's another thing. The present tense and the aorist, that's for me, that's an intermediate milestone. Then
Mm.
everything else, the imperfect, the perfect tense, uh, the future tense might still, so present tense, future tense, and aorist, that's really what an intermediate learner would need. And if you have that, if you can say what is going on now and you can simply report what happened in the past using the aorist tense, that's highly appropriate, I would say, for all sorts of prose Greek. And if you're able to do that, then reading Plato might be a challenge at the beginning, but there is a groove to it. There's a style to it, right? But yeah, the beginning certainly is. I also say to teachers, teaching intermediate to advanced learners is by far much easier than teaching beginners. So
Mm.
teaching beginners is definitely also for a teacher the most challenging thing, certainly.
That makes sense. And kind of going back to what like you mentioned, memorize the poem or memorize maybe a passage, maybe even Plato, memorize some of the dialogue bits or something like that. Like find something you find interesting, memorize it,
Mhm.
and then recite it. Well, going back to think Greek, that's how Homer was done, right? Like it was memorized and recited. Like this was their culture, was memory and recitation. Um, yeah, that's in a in a large way. I mean, that's probably how a lot of the biblical texts were used was they were read aloud. So there was this, like you said, there was this real like embodied use of ear and tongue and lips to, I'll say, perform the text in whatever was appropriate to the genre that
Certainly. I mean,
we've dropped.
if you
So
think about memory, we're now probably in the most impoverished of all
yeah,
generations. Because even when I think of my grandparents, who are all farmers without any notable school education of to speak, right? So if that goes back to the early 20th, maybe, and then when I think of the generation that raised them in the 19th century, people used to have stuff memorized. People
yeah,
used to be able to get together and at least sing songs or yeah, definitely songs and poetry very much was there 150 years ago, totally, in
yeah,
the, broad population. And then they also had other things like prayers and other relevant texts simply on the tip of their tongue, as it were.
yeah,
And then if you read up on ancient education, but also the education of basically all the centuries
yeah,
following that, memory was always a huge part of that. And I'm like people used to memorize not only poetry but also prose. They sat in the library and memorized passages, and they would also quote from memory. Like if you study ancient intertextual references and so on, the
mm,
more often than not, the quote is not precise. Why is that? Didn't he like the wording or something? And then very smart people tell us that this was simply quoted from memory because he didn't want to go back to the library and find with the scroll also. It's not pages. You have to scroll this, work with those scrolls and so on. And the other thing is that if you start memorizing, you'll realize that it's again a snowball. The
hmm.
first hexameter, we're going back to Homer, the
Homer.
first line to memorize is by far the hardest, the second is easier, and so on.
Yeah,
And the first 10 lines are the hardest. Adding another 2 lines to your first 10 lines is actually not that big a deal anymore. Uh, I'm not saying that you just become a sponge and you just memorize everything after reading it once, but there used to be people like that, and yeah, that's definitely something that one might think of putting oneself through. memorizing first poetry, and then maybe, especially if one is so inclined and one cherishes passages from the Bible or from other prose authors, then why not memorize that?
Yeah.
And I also had a client who made a real effort to memorize Genesis.
Mm.
And so,
In
uh,
Koine?
yeah, from in the Septuagint
Septuagint.
Genesis.
Wow. Okay.
That
That's
was
impressive.
very interesting to because then I always basically sat there and read along. And she just asked me if I was willing to do that, and I said, yeah, sure, why not, right? So I read along and then gave her basically simply pointed out where she had missed an article and or hit or added one. But that's also an interesting thing that you can see suddenly that again articles is this typical thing. Does it say to pneuma or just pneuma, right?
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So to hydor and hydor, and then you think about it, and then you start asking the right questions. It's like this whole immersive thing also. It just leads you more often than not, it leads you to be asking the right questions. And you stop working either only from how you would say things in English or only from what the grammar book says because then you
Hmm.
find out like also I think last year I had a situation with a client who then said, "Well, you should have used the perfect tense here, right?" And I'm like, "I think this aorist is totally fine." And then he said, "Yeah, but in this he read in his grammar book about the some use of the perfect, or maybe it was just a run of the mill use of the perfect tense." And this idea was only there because he had read it in some very theoretical context, like in the grammar book.
Yeah.
And he forgot about everything that he had ever read in Greek, that there were aorists like that all the time, right?
Yeah.
So instead of saying um, ekletein, I was called in the aorist, suddenly there was this idea around that you always have to say geklemai. I am in the state of having been called. So in the perfect tense, which is, yes, the perfect tense exists and it's good and so on, but it does not mean that we can't use aorists anymore, especially if it's a relaxed sort of no genre or register, right? So yeah, that's this thing. If yeah, then you start asking the right questions and grow intuitions. If, and this is important, if you make sure that you really work from or that you're exposed to good Greek, so authentic Greek. With good
Hmm.
Greek, I don't mean that Koine is lesser than whatever, but the Greek that you're interested in, you have to become your goal is to familiarize yourself with that, and so spend time with that again, and this is again reading aloud, trying to hit all the syllables, all the stresses and so on for beginners typically enough. Read aloud, and if you dare, also memorize and recite. This is all time well spent because this is exactly what you want to study. And so this is, I'm not saying that this is all that we have to do because then there is a point where, of course, it gets too tedious and too difficult and too frustrating. Then we have to find something else to do. That's clear. But the other extreme is trying to only express yourself and trying to only play in a more creative way, free writing and so on, which is all good, all has its there's time for that, there's a place for that. But then this thing is very simple, just reading aloud, memorizing, reciting, and so on. There should be a place for that too. And it's very, as I said, the good thing is that it's the actual thing that you yearn for. It is the actual text. And there's no, it's not like you can, open a window in your book and you see behind the scenes. No, this
Yeah.
is what it is. Something that I think I understand much better now after starting at least to memorize some Homer. because,
Mm,
because it just is what it is. It's chiseled in stone. I cannot do much. And sometimes you run around with a strange word or a strange line in your head, and you don't you have actually already stopped worrying about why it is what it is. To me, it happened then that 6 months later, I stumble upon some footnote in a grammar book and suddenly understand how this form came to be.
mm.
And, you know, so this it's going like using both feet, both legs, right? So you you take in some material, some specific cases, and then you understand some theory and some general rules. And you have to walk with both legs. You cannot try to only study theory. And yeah.
Well, and I think there's pretty valid underpinning in that. Like if you think about how our brain learned our first language, it was through a lot of examples, and then essentially generalizing from those examples into um, a language, into standardization. And we see that in the development of like children learning English. Like they'll sort of acquire the English past tense, like go and went. They'll use that correctly, and then as they get more exposure, they'll then start saying goed instead of went, because they're like, oh, well, ed is how we make past tense. And then they'll realize, oh, well, here's an exception. But like, there's that process of growth from particulars. So, like you're saying, it makes a lot of sense to say, well, memorize some particular passages or spend time with these particulars, and don't worry so much about the overall theory, because your brain will build that up naturally. And you can also go read that later on too, once you're grounded in some particular, and say, oh, that's why. Like you just said happened with the grammar book 6 months later. It's like, oh, okay, that's what was going on there, right? So,
Oh yes, for sure. Yes, I'm always told that you shouldn't conflate first language acquisition and second language acquisition, but that is certainly true for toddlers. What you said, I mean, it's obvious to everybody who's ever seen or heard a toddler talk. But then I think also for me as a teacher, when I get assignments back or somebody sends me the text for correction, you see that there are some good mistakes people make where it's
mm,
overcorrect or something. You see the idea behind it, and you think that's the right idea. It's
yeah,
just that you weren't lucky, so this verb works differently or something like that. And then for Greek, the even funnier thing is that you sit there correcting homework, and somebody forms a verb form that you've never seen. You're like, what's like, and then you look you look it up in the dictionary. They start with this very intimidating paragraph of morphology, at least LSJ does.
yeah,
And then you find that actually, in some backwater of the ocean of Greek literature, a Greek already formed this verb form. And you see the exact form that your student formed, you see that printed in your dictionary.
it's like I'm not sure how you
Like,
got an ionic form in there, but you managed to pull it off. Good job.
had the same idea. I had the same idea. He applied the same pattern to the same material, and the outcome was the same. So if that isn't thinking Greek, I don't know what is, because
Yeah,
no English in the world takes you there
right.
where he ended up, right? And then of course you comment on it and you talk about it. That's another important thing in a less institutional kind of learning environment. There should be a back and forth. It's not like you take your red pen and you cross it out and say, this is wrong, this is how you form, this is what the aorist of this verb is. But you try to get behind how you ended up writing what you wrote. And
Yeah,
then these are excellent opportunities to talk about, morphology, Greek morphology, which is such a beast.
yeah,
But I also sometimes say to my clients that forming Greek verb forms is is sometimes a bit like forming English sentences, in the sense that what we just adumbrated, right? This person applied a pattern to lexemes or made some added some, you add a prefix, and you have your lexical stem or your verbal stem, and then you add markers for, I don't know, passive and future tense or when personal suffix and so on. And sometimes, and you can see this in those monstrous dictionary entries, you see that really sometimes they seem to have made those up, on the spot, much in the way that we maybe build our sentences.
right.
So not It's not the same. It's more restricted. Morphology is more restricted than syntax. But Greek morphology, if one can say that, is astonishingly free compared to what we are used to, especially in English, but also in German or
Yeah.
in Latin. Most people, I have many people coming to me who already know Latin quite well. And then they come to Greek expecting that it's going to be like Latin morphology, verbal morphology, let's say. And in Latin, the size of it is such that you can really see all of it and kind of comprehend everything in a comprehensive, exhaustive way. You can exhaust it. Whereas, as you know, in Greek there is no end to it because once we're done with the normal stuff, then we are only getting started with the pluperfect and the future perfect and the optative future tense and stuff like that, which conversely I would never want to waste any time uh, with a beginner intermediate because you don't need that if you don't need that to survive, right?
Right.
The only thing you need for survival is present tense and aorist, and mostly you'll be fine.
Well,
And
and
yeah,
like I think about, there's not many pluperfects in the New Testament, right?
yeah,
So like I don't, for what most of my day-to-day reading is done in, New Testament or maybe Septuagint, but it's like when I run across one, I'm like I find it's like, okay, this has a has reduplication, so it looks like a perfect, but it's got an augment on the front. Augment says past tense. It was a in a sense redundant marker of past tense. So I see that, I'm like, okay, well, this is a perfect verb, but it's got past. Okay, that's pluperfect. Like that's it's like I've learned the system of Greek morphology well enough that I don't need to know that paradigm. I can just recognize it because I know the pieces and what the pieces mean. Um,
excellent. You exactly know what I'm talking about. That's what I meant with syntax and
yeah,
morphology. Because especially also when you come from English, you think in auxiliary verbs, you think of adding stuff to make
hmm,
for adding little words to add grammatical information. And Greek does the same with syllables and um, affixes, so stuff that it
yeah,
adds to the word. So it's a what's the word? A synthetic language and not an analytical language, right? So
yeah.
that's
But
and
it's
that
with the
can be
weight.
very neatly pointed out. But my point was also that, especially in the pluperfect, with that what you just termed augment with this prefix with this epsilon. Sometimes it's there, that it's not there, and then
Yeah,
they drive you the one and the same author, even in the same sentence, forms one form with it and the
yeah,
other one without it. And you're like, why? And if you it there used to be a time when this drove me crazy because I wanted to know the truth. I wanted to know what is it, right? Which one is good? Which one is correct? And which one is, an epigonal, uh, badly formed Koine thing or something like this. But if you just say morphology is a bit like syntax, it's quite free. You can. Everybody, I think, understands that you can say one and the same thing in very, very, very many ways. And there are very many sentences that mean the same thing, right? And so if you think about morphology like that, then I think it's a much more mature and reassuring way of thinking
yeah,
thinking about it. Plus, that you see, as I said, when you look at some of those verbs, the really intimidating ones, and you realize that um, yeah, nobody really knew what to do with this, and so they had a couple ways of doing it. Like they had a few ways of marking for the augment, for example, and that's it. They weren't necessarily that much smarter than we are.
yeah.
That's also very reassuring and human, I think. Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
Michael, again, thank you so much for your time.
yeah.
We've already
Thank
hit
you.
about an hour and a half, so I think we should probably wrap
Yeah,
it up. But
yeah.
so if people want to find you, maybe they want to take classes with you or find out about your projects and what you're working on, what's the best way for someone to connect with you?
So I'm trying to be available on social media, Facebook, and this X, formerly known as Twitter and Instagram and so on, where one can find us as Agros Education. So
Okay.
Agros spelled with Latin letters Agros Education. I think there is an easy way, or they can email us. Or maybe you have a way of adding a link or something in your.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. I've got your
Yeah.
Twitter
Good.
profile, and I can find your other. I can
Yeah,
probably
but
put Twitter and your website and things like that in the email or in the show
that's
description,
right.
show
That's
notes.
right. That's nice. Yeah, I have people. We have really have people from all kinds of people finding their way to us. So I'm confident that the internet is gonna do its thing, and then it's all gonna work out. Yeah,
Yeah.
good. And yeah, we are providing, as I said, mostly. So yeah, all levels, especially individually, I'm really open to doing whatever. I've clients with whom I read Homer or Plato or Sophocles or also New Testament church fathers. I'm always happy to give my 2 cents and see what I can do to help. And then also I should mention I haven't really had time to conceptualize my own classes, but if anyone came and said they wanted to have a group class with, I don't know, 2 or 3 other people, I'm also happy to do that. And in general, like we have to get together, say hello, and talk about it, and then I can see if and how I can help. But I'm happy to, of course, share my expertise, little I have.
Well, great.
Good.
So it sounds like you're really open to customizing to meet the needs of learners. So
Very much so.
that's a great
Yes.
great setup. So yeah.
Good.
Well, thank you. Hopefully we'll be able to maybe have you back in a while and find out how things are going and
Sure.
any
No,
other new projects and talk about those too. So
it's a pleasure talking to you. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Intro and outro music is Funky Thanksgiving by Admiral Bob, used with gratitude under Creative Commons 3.0 Attribution License. The track can be found at dig.ccmixer.org.